Hey everyone, welcome to today's Explainer. Today, we are unpacking a really fascinating strategic and demographic framework for a massive global movement. We're going to be looking at the source material presented by Missionary Young Cho. And what's so interesting here is how Cho takes biblical exegesis and pairs it with some pretty deep demographic analysis to outline an incredibly ambitious initiative. We are going to explore how theological motivation is being matched up with the sheer, raw math of human multiplication to attempt what could be one of the largest spiritual shifts in modern history. Let's get right into it.
2033. Just think about that year for a second. What if this specific year was poised to mark a definitive turning point in global demographics? In our source material, Young Cho anchors his entire global vision to this exact date. It's not just a random target picked out of thin air, it is a deadline driven by major historical significance. But before we get into the massive scale of what this year actually represents, let's look at how we're going to break this all down today.
All right, here is our roadmap for the Explainer. We're going to cover the 2033 global vision, crossing to the other side, the global harvest reality, the math of multiplication, and finally, the starfish principle.
Okay, Section 1, the 2033 Global Vision. Let's start with this massive global goal.
So, why 2033? Well, Young Cho explains that the year 2033 actually represents the 2000th anniversary of Jesus' resurrection, Pentecost, and literally the birth of the Christian church. For Cho, along with a massive coalition of global leaders, this is the ultimate catalyst. They've launched what's called the 2033 Billion Soul Harvest, and it is exactly what it sounds like, an organized, totally data-driven initiative aiming to reach 1 billion new born-again believers globally by that 2000th anniversary. It's a huge moment of global collaboration, with different organizations sharing resources, sharing data, and building strategies, all aimed directly at this monumental deadline.
But what is the why behind all of this? That brings us to Section 2, crossing to the other side.
Cho anchors his entire framework on this one single verse from the book of Mark, where Jesus tells his disciples, "Let us go over to the other side." Now, Cho points out that Jesus wasn't just, going for a casual boat ride. He was intentionally leaving a comfortable crowd and navigating through a deadly storm. And why? To reach a single, marginalized, demon-possessed individual on the other side. Cho uses this narrative as the ultimate blueprint for global missions, essentially leaving the comfortable majority to cross treacherous waters for the sake of the unreached.
The crucial point here is how Cho translates this ancient boat ride into a modern strategic framework. According to him, crossing to the other side requires 3 steps. First up, surrender. Just as the experienced fishermen disciples had to completely drop their maritime assumptions in a supernatural storm, individuals have to surrender their own plans. Second, leaving the crowd. This means actively rejecting the secular majority and comfortable norms. And third, taking Jesus as he is. Cho vividly warns against what he calls shredding Jesus into pieces. He argues that people today have a tendency to cherry-pick the comforting teachings while completely ignoring the difficult, demanding calls to action. A true movement, Cho argues, absolutely requires embracing the whole message without filtering it.
So, what does this other side look like today when we look at the raw data? Section 3, the global harvest reality.
The stark reality of these numbers is absolutely fascinating. Out of our 8 billion global population, Cho points out that the data shows about 2.6 billion people identify as Christian, split roughly between Catholics and Protestants. But Cho notes that this number includes a lot of cultural or nominal followers. When you really drill down into the data, fewer than 1 billion are considered active, born-again believers. This gap highlights the sheer, massive scale of their target. Think about it. To reach another billion people by 2033 means they essentially have to double the current core population of the movement in just a decade.
And this data reveals a complete paradigm shift away from the West. Young Cho details some really unprecedented, explosive numbers in non-Western nations. Take Indonesia, long known as the largest Muslim-majority nation. There are now an estimated 50 million believers. In India, despite some extreme cultural complexities, Cho notes the data suggest at least 5% of the population, which is around 75 million people, are believers, with certain regions seeing incredibly rapid transformation. Over in Lagos, Nigeria, there are megachurches functioning as entire networks with 10 million members gathering for prayer. And even in the UAE, out of a mostly expat population, roughly 4 million are bringing their faith into the region, which is resulting in massive permitted gatherings. The modern other side is almost entirely non-Western.
But how do you realistically reach 1 billion people in just over a decade? Section 4, the math of multiplication.
Young Cho contrasts 2 distinct models of growth using pure, simple mathematics. First, you have the traditional crusade model.
Picture a massive stadium event. Cho calculates that if you hold a massive daily crusade of 100,000 people, and a very generous 20,000 of them become believers every single day, well, doing the math against an 8 billion person global population, it would still take a staggering 1,070 years to reach the world. That is the limitation of addition. But on the flip side, we see the multiplication model. If one person reaches just one other person in a year, and the next year they both reach one person, it creates exponential growth. Using this multiplication model, it takes only 34 years to reach all 8 billion people on Earth.
Cho applies this exact multiplication math directly to the 2033 vision. He points out that if there are roughly 1 billion born-again believers today, you don't even need all of them to participate. If just 10% of current believers, that's 100 million people, successfully reach just one person per year, that 1 billion goal can actually be achieved in exactly a decade. It takes this seemingly impossible billion-person goal and transforms it into a highly attainable, individual yearly metric. So how does this macro math apply to everyday life? Finally, let's look at Section 5, the starfish principle.
To bring these massive billions down to the micro impact of the individual, Cho shares a classic anecdote. A boy is walking along a beach where thousands of dying starfish have washed ashore. The boy is picking them up, one by one, and throwing them back into the ocean. An older woman walks by, tells him to stop, and points out the sheer scale of the beach. She basically says, there are tens of thousands of them. You can't possibly make a difference.
But the boy just bends down, picks up another starfish, throws it into the water, and replies, well, it made a difference to that one. And this perfectly encapsulates Cho's ultimate point. The global vision of the 2033 billion soul harvest doesn't actually start with a billion. It starts with a single, dedicated connection. When you get lost in the macro data of billions of people, you kind of lose the plot. The movement relies entirely on the individual deciding that the one person in front of them is worth the effort of crossing to the other side. It's a great reminder that massive global shifts aren't just about statistics. They are built entirely on everyday interactions.
And that leaves us with a truly provocative thought to end on for today's explainer. We've looked at the theology, the shifting demographics, and the sheer math of global multiplication. But all of that data hinges on the power of a single individual. In a sprawling, complex world of 8 billion people, it is so easy to feel insignificant. But if exponential growth really relies on just one connection sparking another, how much power does one individual's targeted action truly hold in shaping the future of the globe? Thank you so much for joining me today, and I hope this gave you a really clear, structured understanding of this massive global initiative.